Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking at a Supreme Court case, Box v. Planned Parenthood of Indiana and Kentucky. So, the quick version. The Supreme Court basically upheld an Indiana law about how fetal remains are disposed of by abortion providers. They reversed a lower court on that. But interestingly, they decided not to rule on a different part of that same law, the part dealing with banning abortions based on sex, race, or disability. So one piece got the okay, the other's still kind of up in the air legally. Let's dig into what actually happened.
Right. So this Indiana law, the one at the center of it all, it really changed the rules for abortion providers in the state about, handling fetal remains.
Yep.
It specifically said these remains couldn't be treated like, infectious or pathological waste, which meant they couldn't just be incinerated along with other stuff from surgery.
Okay, so it was a specific handling requirement.
Exactly. And the law also allowed for fetal remains to be cremated simultaneously together, which is actually something Indiana law usually doesn't permit for other human remains.
Huh. That's interesting. But it didn't stop a woman from deciding herself what happens, right?
That's a really crucial point. No, her existing right to decide on the final disposition, that wasn't changed by this law.
Okay, but before the Supreme Court got it, the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals had actually tossed out this disposal rule. What was their thinking?
Yeah, they did invalidate it. They used what's called rational basis review, which, is usually a very easy standard for a law to meet. The government just needs a legitimate interest and a rational link.
Right, a low bar.
A very low bar. But the Seventh Circuit said, Indiana's claimed interest here, this idea of humane and dignified disposal of human remains. They said that wasn't actually a legitimate interest for the state in this context.
Really? They rejected the interest itself?
They did, and they went further, saying, look, even if it were legitimate, the law didn't make sense. Because, one, the woman could still choose individual disposal anyway, and two, the law itself allowed this simultaneous cremation thing, so they didn't see the rational connection.
But the Supreme Court clearly didn't buy that reasoning.
Not at all. Their main opinion, the per curiam one, it went straight back to a 1983 case, Akron v. Akron Center for Reproductive Health. And in Akron, the court had already said states do have a, quote, legitimate interest in proper disposal of fetal remains.
So there was precedent.
Exactly. The Supreme Court basically said the Seventh Circuit flat out missed this. They said it was clear error not to recognize this established interest as a valid reason for Indiana's law.
Okay, so the interest was legitimate according to the Supreme Court. Then how did they view the connection, the rational basis part?
Well, applying that same rational basis test, the Supreme Court said, yes, the law is rationally related to that interest. They sort of reminded everyone that under this test, the person challenging the law has a heavy lift. They have to prove there's no conceivable reason for the law.
Right. It doesn't have to be the best law, just a rational one.
Precisely. The court acknowledged it might not be perfectly tailored, maybe not the ideal solution, but that's not the standard. It just needed that rational link to the state's interest in proper disposal.
And it's really important to underline, this whole fight was only about that rational basis standard, right? It wasn't argued as an undue burden on abortion access.
That's absolutely key. The court made a point of saying this. Planned Parenthood didn't make the undue burden argument about this specific disposal regulation. So the whole case, start to finish, was decided using only rational basis review.
Which is a much lower hurdle for the state to clear than undue burden.
Much lower. And the court explicitly said their decision here gives zero opinion on how a similar law might fare if it were challenged under the undue burden standard. That's a whole different analysis.
Okay, so that covers the fetal remains part. But you mentioned there were two parts to this Indiana law. What about the second one? What about selective abortions?
Right, the second provision. That part tried to ban abortion providers from performing an abortion if they knew their reason was based on the fetus's sex, race, or a diagnosis like Down syndrome.
And on that part, the Supreme Court decided not to decide.
Pretty much. They denied certiorari on that question.
Which, just to remind listeners, denying cert doesn't mean they agree or disagree with the lower court ruling on it. It's often about timing, right? Letting an issue develop more.
Exactly. It's standard practice. The court often waits for more appellate courts, more circuits to weigh in on a complex or new issue before they take it up themselves. Lets the legal arguments percolate, as they sometimes say.
Okay. But even though they denied cert, that didn't stop some justices from writing about it. Justice Thomas wrote a concurrence, didn't he?
He did. He agreed with the outcome upholding the fetal remains part, denying cert on the selective abortion ban part. But then he wrote separately and quite extensively about Well, about eugenics.
Eugenics. How did he connect that?
He went into the history, linking it to the early birth control movement, Margaret Sanger's views, historical eugenics in the U.S., things like forced sterilization, the Buck v. Bill case.
Wow, okay, so he was drawing a historical line.
He was drawing a line, yes, and arguing that abortion, especially with modern prenatal screening, could potentially become, in his view, a tool for a sort of modern-day eugenics.
What kind of examples did he raise?
He pointed to data showing high rates of abortion following a Down syndrome diagnosis. He also talked about sex-selective abortions, which are a major issue globally, and, he noted, can occur within certain groups in the U.S. too. And he mentioned racial disparities in abortion rates in America as part of this broader concern.
So his argument was that these factors raise the specter of eugenic motivations creeping into abortion decisions today.
That was his expressed concern, yes, that these kinds of selective abortions could be seen through a eugenics lens.
But he still agreed with denying cert for now.
He did. He basically said, look, the constitutionality of these kinds of laws banning eugenic abortions, that's a big question the court will probably have to deal with eventually. But he thought it was right to wait, let more lower courts wrestle with it first before the Supreme Court steps in.
Okay. And we also heard from Justice Ginsburg on this case, right? She had a different take.
Yes, Justice Ginsburg. She actually concurred in part and dissented in part. She agreed with denying cert on the selective abortion question, no issue there, but she disagreed strongly with how the majority handled the fetal remains issue. She wouldn't have just summarily reversed the Seventh Circuit like that.
Why not? What was her objection?
Her core issue was the standard of review. She argued that rational basis wasn't the right test here. She believed that because this regulation touched on abortion, even indirectly, it implicated a woman's fundamental right to choose, and therefore, a higher level of scrutiny, heightened review should have been applied, not just the minimal rational basis test.
So she thought the court took the easy way out by sticking to rational basis just because that's how the case was argued.
Essentially, yes. She felt it was kind of a waste of the court's time to decide it purely based on what she called the challenger's strategic litigation choice to use rational basis. She implied the outcome might have been different under a tougher standard.
So, stepping back, what are the big takeaways here? This case clearly confirms the court sees regulating fetal remains disposal as a legitimate state interest.
Definitely. It firms that up. And it really highlights, again, how crucial the standard of review is in these cases. Rational basis versus undue burden, they lead to very different places.
Yeah, that distinction seems critical.
Absolutely. And then you have Justice Thomas's concurrence, which really pushes the difficult, very charged issue of eugenics and abortion into the spotlight. By linking it to history and current practices, he's signaling this debate isn't over. It might be coming back to us.
And the fact they didn't take up the selective abortion ban itself means that whole area of law is still very much developing in the lower courts.
Still unresolved, yeah. Could definitely be back on the Supreme Court's docket down the line.
All right, let's move to our final segment, the 10th chair. If talk testimonies had a vote in Box v. Planned Parenthood, well, I'd land with the majority on upholding the fetal remains rule. But my reasoning would be maybe a bit different. I'd focus it more squarely on the state's interest in, let's say, public health and maintaining certain ethical standards for handling biological materials from medical procedures.
Okay. So less about potential dignity arguments and more about practical regulation.
Kind of. I mean, you acknowledge the woman's right to choose, of course, but the state does have a clear interest in making sure biological materials are disposed of safely, sanitarily, and maybe also reflecting a certain societal respect for what was potential life without getting into the deeper philosophical weeds that Justice Thomas explored. And crucially, because this law allows the woman her own choice for disposal, it doesn't seem like a substantial obstacle to the abortion itself. So rational basis seems to fit that public health and ethical handling rationale.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about a second question, the selective abortion ban where the court denied cert?
Yeah, on that one, I'd agree with the denial. Look, the issues Justice Thomas raises about eugenics are profound, deeply troubling, and they absolutely deserve serious thought and debate. But from a judicial standpoint, especially with such a novel and ethically explosive legal question, letting it percolate more in the lower courts seems like the prudent path. You want to see how different circuits handle it, what arguments develop? Judicial restraint feels appropriate there.
So wait for more legal development before the highest court weighs in definitively.
Exactly. So the 10th chair vote would be affirm the reversal on fetal remains disposal based on that public health handling interest under rational basis, but agree to deny review on the selective abortion ban for now, pending further lower court consideration.
Well, this deep dive into Box v. Planned Parenthood certainly unpacked a lot, from the specifics of fetal remains rules to these huge, looming questions about selective abortions and eugenics.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And just a reminder, everything we've discussed, especially our 10th chair segment, is just our commentary and analysis. It's for discussion, not legal advice, and obviously doesn't reflect the actual court's views.
Right. We definitely encourage everyone listening to read more about this case, think about the complex legal and ethical dimensions here. We're always interested in hearing your perspectives, too.